Hi, this is Schnebly with Educating with Wisdom, and this is the second part of Did African American civil rights leaders basically deride the women's rights movement globally? Yes. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't believe that it was just African American civil rights leaders that did it in any way, shape, or form. There were all these intellectuals, and some of them were women who showed up there. Cher. And I think Cher is beautiful. I think she's very talented. But what she did was terrible for women. And she did it to market herself. Madonna. I can't believe we're the same age. And I actually can sing. Okay. Jimmy Carter. I'm sure if there's one in an interview he wished he could erase off, it would have been Jimmy Carter. There were other clergy who went out there, but none of them had that good housekeeping stamp of approval as Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, none of them. They all happened after that. None of them. Okay, I have to. I'm going to see the link that was made, not just with women and this, but how they linked African Americans to gay, to being like in order to have this larger picture of people that were going to help look after the African American movement, they linked themselves with the gay movement. And you're going to see in what I wrote that the act of being black is not a sin before God, and the act of being a woman is not a sin before God, but the act of homosexuality is. And that if we go back and we change that paradigm, because of the definitional difference and because of how we act differently as people, much of it goes by way of the wayside. It does. If you actually teach the history and teach the proper nomenclature coming out of Hebrew and Aramaic, the paradigms, it goes away. The need to be a transsexual goes away. Ask yourself, if you were a man here and you said you wanted to be a woman, if I told you first before you get the chance to do that you have to go be a woman in Afghanistan, how many boys and women would say, okay, I'm going to go to Afghanistan, I'll be a woman there, and you see, I come back in 3 years, I'll still want to do that. No, it doesn't happen. Or in Egypt, up until a few years ago, with the clitorectomies that happened, how about you go there first? First you practice being a woman. Nobody would want to be a woman. This is not something you choose to be, it's something that you are. And it's up to us to look at how we have warped that definition. Now, part of the problem, part of the reason that we're having this problem is because we're not going to Hadam and what Christ said. We're looking at every possible animal act a human being could have done. And in order to do that, we have to look at the animal people that first came out of Africa. They're not Hadam. They're not. They did not have the intelligence to be these scientists that did all these things. That's not them. They weren't given the one man, one woman rule. That's not them. Hadam is not out of Africa. Hadam came down into the area of Israel. Came down into the area of Israel. And we have to come to terms with that, and so do the Africans. Now that's a hard pill, because the last 50 years have been everything emanated out of Africa. Everything did not emanate out of Africa. And when the rest of the world had held on to agriculture, south of the Sahara was barely doing agriculture. They were backwards beyond belief. So I think it's very important to understand that it's time to hold all these things accountable. and yet say that the form of slavery we had going on, lifetime slavery, anywhere is wrong. Whether it's how Islam treated women in harems, oh my goodness gracious, if you knew. Whoa! Or how the boys and the men were used with their genitalia cut off, and I mean some of them with their penises as well. Whoa, that even happened in China. Or how Islam wouldn't do that to their own slaves, so they sent it to Coptic priests. Excuse me, out of Egypt. Egypt produces so much garbage, it's not funny. All right? And they did it for them. I mean, that was part of what they had to do to survive as a Christian community. They did that to their male slaves. They would send them there. I mean, what we did was horrific. I gotta put it on pause because I've got to be upset here for a moment. It's still doing it? No, it's doing it. One of the people who interviewed at Playboy was Margaret Atwood. Now, I'm also a Canadian and an American. Now, she did this thing of The Handmaid's Tale. Imagine if Margaret Atwood had managed to actually read the Bible through feminist eyes and see what happened to Sarah. How Abraham pimped her out twice. He prays for, he negotiates for Sodom and Gomorrah. He looks after, negotiates with Ishmael. He does the same thing for Hagar. He's doing the same thing for Lot. He goes to bat, raises an army for Lot, but not once do you hear him praying about what's going to happen with Sarah. Or does he say to God, please God, do something so that I don't have to do this with my wife? There's nothing there. He just makes a bundle. And the last time he pimps her out to get rid of her, the king, I believe it's Amalek, says, you know something, you're getting rid of your wife. And God is telling me this is wrong. And Abraham is saying, it's the same feeble story. And Amalek, I think that's his name, says, for the sake of your wife, because Abraham didn't want to take her back, for the sake of your wife, I'm giving you all this money. And he's letting the entire community know that with Abraham, that Abraham is getting all this money because of what happened to Sarah. And he's protecting, the king is protecting Sarah. Now at no point here is Abraham ever praying and looking after and asking God to look after Sarah. Complete silence. It's amazing. So, had Margaret Atwood looked at that, that would have been really revolutionary, because the whole issue of slavery and slavery among the Hebrew people starts with Abraham's treatment of Sarah. That's the only reason why they have Hagar. Now that's a whole different story now. Yeah. So, if I take a look at this, we're going to go on now and pick it up from where I left off at this last point, and I'm going to show you some documentation. I want you to understand that I have written in several different places that I tell them vis-a-vis what's going on with gay rights, clergy and other people, rather than outing the true paradigm and the true wording, what they meant, the feminine nature. They compare civil rights and women's rights and say now it's gay rights. Well, that's what African American leaders did. Why? Because the act of being black is not a sin before God. The state of being black is not a sin. The state of being a woman is not a sin. But homosexuality is. That is against that Hadam rule, that rule of Christ, the one woman, one man. But you're going to hear maybe part of the reason why they did not want that to come out. Okay. Let's put it on pause for a moment. We're talking about a God-given responsibility. And if need be, we will die fighting for it. Because that paradigm under God must be changed. Everybody is trying to do it civilly, and there's a problem with civil responsibilities. Now, I know that sounds weird, because what happens is that when you do it civilly, you're not working within the framework that God wants you to do it in. And that's what the African American men did. They didn't do it under God. They did it civilly. Why didn't they do it under God? Well, slavery is still allowed in the New Testament. Oh, sure, everyone is free in Christ, but as an institution, it's still allowed. But polygamy and adultery is not. Isn't that interesting? Very interesting. And what's also interesting is that Africa was very involved in terms of selling African people. Oh, there was some hard-headedness on the part of Europeans and Islam, but the Africans themselves were very instrumental in doing this. And Islam went wading all over the Barbary Coast and also into the Caucasus to get white women, because white women were tributes, so millions of white women were taken. And white men were taken, and they would cut off their information, as they did with African men. That's what Islam did. Typically speaking, Europeans bred Africans, but not Islam. I had to sneeze. Now, the other problem here is that by allowing this to fall so, and allowing us to sexually fall so, the Africans, or I don't want to say the Africans, because the Africans are fine. The Africans are not doing it. The Africans are fighting against what we're doing in the West. Yay, Africa, you keep doing that. You can see I write about this, and you're going to see that. So they're actually fighting that. I thought about it. I said the same thing they said. The act of being a woman is not a sin against God. The act of being a man is not a sin. The act of being black is not a sin, but the act of homosexuality is. I already have that online. And so what this whole group has done is it dropped the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement to this new level now. It dropped it instead of holding it up because it wanted to do it civilly. What they had to do is go back and say, you know what, we made a really, really big mistake here. And the whole terminology is wrong. And then everything could have had a fresh start. Now, the other thing to remember about the African American movement, and Africans need to learn this as well, is that prior to the Anthony Johnson, John Castor case, under common law, there was no such thing as lifetime slavery unless you had done something illegal. So in the 1600s, the latter part of the 1600s, there was an African from Angola, and his English name was Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson went through his indentured servitude, and as an indentured servant, after you did your stint, you were given help, your parcel of land, you were given other things to get you started, and he got like 75 acres or something like that, or maybe it was more. And then you go out and you have your life. And it works a little bit like the Jewish system, that you would do your thing for 7 years, and if you were then a part of the community, they would set you up to really be a part of the community. That didn't happen for female slaves. That's a mistake, but that's beside the point. All right. Anthony Johnson went out and he got his freedom, and he had 5 slaves. And I guess, according to contrary sources, 4 of them were white indentured, and 1 of them was an African indentured slave by the name of John Castor. John Castor more than did his stint. This was going on 13 years, and Anthony Johnson wasn't letting him go. John Castor had offers from and witnesses from other white farmers in the area who offered to set him up. And what happened then is that they
Wait a minute.
for his freedom. And Anthony Johnson initially lost. Initially, the provisional court said, yes, this man has done his job for you, and now he's free. And he went to work for somebody else because Johnson wasn't going to give him his due. At which point, Anthony Johnson then goes back to court and argues that John Castor was his property, and you can't take somebody's property. So the Anthony Johnson and the John Castor case is the first time there's lifetime slavery in the United States. And that is an African who did that to another African. We have a lot of things to discuss. There was white slavery. You should really look up white slavery. Okay, right here we're dealing with the issue of John Castor. Please take a moment to look this up. I wish I could make this smaller, but I can't. I'm sorry. All right, the John Castor case, Anthony Johnson. We're going to come right over here. Famous Families, Frontline. There is Frontline did a piece on it whereby it said perhaps there was a blurring of information because perhaps he was Hispanic, black, he was mulatto. I should say the Anthony Johnson case. So Hispanics, blacks could then do it to other people. I don't know how that worked. There were a lot of Hispanic blacks, but this also happened in Haiti and other places. Lighter black people take lead and take over other people, darker people. Let's close out of this. I don't agree to that. Did black people own slaves? Yeah, there's a fact check. You should probably go in and take a look at it. By the way, if African Americans, and rightly so, they are hurt about their slavery, they should be looking at the British, the Portuguese were a mess, the British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and they should go back to those original colonies and say, you do something about it. And this is the problem with England. England wants the United States to do something about their problem. You're going to find the Europeans always want the Americans to do something about the European problem. And right now, Africa wants former Africans, the people that were here slaves. They want them to clean up their problem after they went and enslaved them. It's the problem of the people that treated you so badly and you got away from them. They want you to come back and solve your problem. And that's what they do. They're awful. If there's anything I could tell African Americans, Africa is looking for you to take care of their problem after they did that to you, just as Europe wanted us to take care of their problems and still do. Here we go. Arab slave trade, white slavery. Now, when they talk about the Barbary Coast, this was something that happened after the 1600s. But even before then, when you were looking at the harems into the year 1200, 1300, 1400, the tribute was to come and get white slaves, white women. And some of these people were brought into Africa. At the same rate? No. And there were Jewish people involved in selling these white slaves as well. It's a very, very complicated. Slavery is a horror, it's... Anyway, here we go. So let's close out of that. Why aren't the stories the horrible fate of the first black to be cleared? Let's put this on pause for a moment. Okay, this is from the Smithsonian. And there were African people here, former slaves and that, and people that came over with money who owned black slaves in the United States. Even in the 1800s, in 1830, they still owned black slaves. There were something like 4,500 of them that owned about 12,000 slaves. I'm not saying any of this is okay, and I'm not saying that they treated things badly. I don't know. And I'm not trying to justify the slavery that went on in the United States. I'm not trying to do that. I'm saying, in order for us to have a real discussion, we have to discuss slavery in general, and not just Black Americans, because the Black Americans themselves did not come from perfect. And the women have been enslaved, and poor people are enslaved, and it's just bad. Okay. So, okay. So please go on and read that. Okay, here is a document that looks after baptisms. I wrote this because the whole of the whole fraud regarding the Meghan Markle baptism, and oh my God, how fraudulent is this? But let's come down to this, where I am pulling out of the Episcopal Church for a while. Because of the fact that they have made an analogy, a comparison between homosexuality and being women, or homosexuality and being Black. And I'm saying how I was hurt. I mean, my whole family was hurt because of a bisexual man who didn't disclose who was my lawyer, and the rights given to my former husband. So let's go on and see, because this is already online. Father, please be careful when using the argument that homosexuality was accepted in the past. So was slavery, terrible misogyny, child sacrifice, and no peace. These were not better times. When I went before the Law Society, my former lawyer had not taken my divorce case to court, but he took gay civil cases to court. Udo, my former husband, was sexually deviant, and one of the things he told people was that he wanted to get dressed up in women's clothing. All right. Let's go so that you can see through this. I understand why women become involved in the gay movement, especially I've had African American women. They have no partners. They need people to help them bring up their families. I understand all of that. I know that. Okay? I know all of that. The linking of Black or women's rights to the acceptance of homosexuality is to link a beautiful creation of God to that of pathology. The linking of Black or women's rights to the acceptance of homosexuality is to link a beautiful creation of God to that of pathology. That's what this African American civil rights movement did, as well as Barack Obama, Meghan Markle, the British Crown, the Episcopal Church, all of them. The bringing life attribute of the vagina and its pleasures is equal to that of a defecating anus with all the disease associated with it. That is a tough one, isn't it? What is misogyny? What analogy is the church making here? I understand that there are elements of sin in heterosexual behaviors, but let's not throw the baby out with the water, and please do not bring up the female head bishop unless, of course, we can discuss the queen bee syndrome and co-optations into a male-dominated society. I learned about this almost 30 years ago when I took a course in industrial psychology and studied what kinds of women male-dominated organizations promote. I wrote a paper on it. Okay, let's take a look when this was done, July the 22nd. I'm going to open this up here. See if I can begin this here. Maybe I can. Will it open? It will. Right there. Is it going to open? It's trying to. It's hard to do it. Let's take a peek. So I'm actually doing this I've been doing this for years, primary archetyping. Right. I've been cyber stalked and cyber monitored. Intelligence. So what's wrong with the intelligence if the intelligence asked us to do it? Let's go into the sins piled as high as the sky. Told Mr. Rusiano there. Beams filth around our satellites, filth that other people do not have control over, and their kids can get. I told them that the universe does not want this. Right, the pins. So, I've been doing this for a while. At that point, this was 2015, since I said this to him, the U.S. has not been able to launch a rocket into space. 3 failed. The Russians can. The Russians do not equate women, their rights to safety, and sin, being a homosexual or transgender. The President's State of the Union address is G4S in Russia. Leo men equate women with sin. Everyone is entitled to safety, but don't equate women. And white Leo clergy have also stated African Americans to me with acts of sin. What kind of message does that send to men in Africa and the Middle East? Ask yourselves this. What are they saying? Women's rights now, we don't get women's rights unless we get gay rights? Is that what they're saying? This is what the British are saying. This is what Meghan Markle is saying. This is what now the Duchess, this is what Barack Obama is saying. They link women's rights to gay rights. The militant Islamic men who keep and rape young women who come to them, or abductions of others, have for years watched documentaries about young women being abducted from foreign countries, brought to the West U.S., being drugged and raped multiple times every day for years by Western and Christian men who feel entitled to it. Okay? I'm very critical, folks. To go in now and take a look at some of these other things, but I grew up with pornography, and it was horrific, and it made me a feminist. Also, when I was 6 years old and when I got my first Bible, the King James Version, my dad read Genesis to me, and much of it, and as soon as I heard the creation story of 2nd Genesis and 3rd Genesis and 4th Genesis, I said, this is a 6-year-old. That is not God. Somebody did something there and it wasn't God. And I spent much of my life looking to find out what that was. And I found it. And so have a lot of other people out there. But the powers of darkness want to make it a civil thing. And they don't want to make it about God. And really, folks, it's about God. The other thing is, I had an abortion. I became sexually active in my mid-teens. I had no business being sexually active then, but I grew up with this anger. I grew up moving to get ahead with my father's job. We had to move, so I was isolated. I was thrown into situations that I shouldn't have been thrown into, and I offered this. And by the time I was 19, I had had an abortion. And I was practicing birth control. I was practicing rhythm. This is directly related to my father's pornography. I'm telling you right now it is. And directly related, and that pornography is directly related to that false paradigm. Now, let's go and move my mouth backwards back here for a moment. Oh, I guess I'll wait and do it at the end. Hold on. Okay. Could have changed that because they understood the hurtful nature and the power of words. But they took the lowest road possible. Let's go back and do that. All right? And that lowest let's say this again. What I wanted to add, and I didn't, is I wanted to say when I was growing up, also this girl around the age of 10, 11, 12, my father would view this Playboy while my mother was serving him lunch, and he had this man come in, his name was Dan Herzog, who would read Playboy with my father at lunchtime while I was there, and I'm like 11, 12 years old. And Dan's wife had 3 children. She was always exhausted. She had these young 3 children, and here she thinks he's having a safe lunch with my mother. And this is what they're doing in front of my mother and in front of myself, like I was invisible, like my mother was invisible. We just didn't even matter. And I've seen so many instances where men are doing this in front of women, and it just doesn't matter. We're just completely invisible to them. But later, he went on and became an Episcopal priest. This man was going to be a Catholic priest. This man then went on and became an Episcopal priest. Then he went on and became a bishop within the Episcopal Church. Then he left the Episcopal Church because he didn't like the gay readings. Then he came back into the Episcopal Church. But what also happened is that when I went through my cursillo when I was 21 years old, my father was one of the royals and he sponsored me to go through my cursillo. At the closing ceremony, there was my dad. And who shows up but Dan Herzog? And Dad thought this was so neat that Dan Herzog, who is now an Episcopal priest, that Dan Herzog shows up at my cursillo. And instead of this being this wonderful religious experience that I've just culminated with, I was 22, I just graduated from college, instead of it being this wonderful experience, now I'm confronted with the pornography that these 2 men witnessed in front of me. And it's like men just robbed me of this. And I'm telling you this because I'm telling you what the impact of this is, of what you're doing, gentlemen and ladies. What's going on here? My sister also had an abortion. We have other women that I know that have had abortions. Some women I know have tried to commit suicide because of very horrible body imaging. This is a horrific, horrific thing. And when the African American system allows this to happen, and then we have people like Barack Obama that go to Africa and link women's rights to gay rights, what are they saying to these people? I mean, what are you doing to us? I'm not saying that you should crucify these people over there, but really, folks, what are you doing? Meghan Markle, the Crown, they want to link everything to being women? Are you kidding? Okay, let's continue now. It is in rhythm. This is directly related to my father's pornography. I'm telling you right now it is. And directly related, and that pornography is directly related to that false paradigm. African American clergy could have changed that because they understood the hurtful nature and the power of words. But they took the lowest road possible. Right? And that lowest road put pornography all over the world and changed everything. It put pornography all throughout the internet and changed everything. They changed everything. And on top of that, the media slid. The values of family slid. All these things have just gone down. There has been no benefit whatsoever to pornography other than to challenge people of God to wake up and say, and that's not even a loving relationship. Then there's my adult relationship with my husband. My former husband was a nudist, so I thought if I were growing up, I didn't want to live in pornography, so I thought I would try to do something natural, and I was a vegetarian and all those things, which I think is perfectly good. And I think when you're first married, if you want to run around naked with each other, I think that's good too. I think that's fine. But as the children got older, my husband was still running around naked. And he had taken pictures of them as children that some of them were very inappropriate and had exchanged them with people and had them in our family photo album. I had no rights and I had terrible depression. I had anxiety. I was in the hospital. I was abused also from what was happening from my family. I had the psychiatrist tell me, I'm not accepting my role as a housewife, and I have a degree in psychology, which I know is nonsense. And by the way, the person who told me that was a person from India. I had somebody from India, somebody from Africa, and I was always the problem. And my witnesses included the dean of the business school, other faculty who were absolutely against what was going to happen. But this comes back to the Adam and Eve story. The fact that what's wrong is knowing that Eve is wrong for knowing that she needs to be covered up. And they're better off to run around without their clothes on. And the church has always promoted that this was a fall. And in fact, it was an elevation in humanity. They got it completely backwards. I'm sorry about the thing in my mouth open. Let's go. They gave me drugs. I got sick. I got jaundice. They told me it was all in my head. And all of these things happened. And they said that that could have been Udo's right to walk around without his clothes on. When my daughter was 5 and my son was 10. And then my son was 11 and my daughter was 6. And then my son was 12 and my daughter was 9. And I had no rights. I had no rights to take these out of the catalogs. I had no rights of anywhere because it was natural. This is the church and this is the paradigm. And this is going to change. Okay, thank you. Let's go in and take a look at some of these other things.